He joined me a few times to preview the NFL draft. Now that it's all done, he's here to take a look at the aftermath with me. And Ben, it's always great to have you aboard. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Of course, obviously, yeah. It's definitely draft grade season this Sunday following the draft, but it was fun 3 days. Definitely can't complain about that.
It was a fun 3 days. And before we dive into some of these grades, does the NFL draft typically cause you to have any sort of stock up, stock down with regards to the futures market? Because typically when I take a look at the draft, there are certainly teams that I feel like they help themselves out in terms of like odds to win the division, maybe a yes, no to make the playoffs. Typically, I think that when it comes to the NFL draft, though, the teams at the top, they really don't get affected by me because there's a reason why a team like the Kansas City Chiefs is picking at the back half of the first round, and a team like, the Houston Texans are drafting as highly as they are, and typically it takes multiple years for those guys to make that big impact.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't think we see like a ton of movement in any specific futures market kind of coming out of the draft. I think the one, change that we would have even seen from like last week at this time was probably in a lot of ways like the Baltimore Ravens and the AFC North. And I think that situation was more, a resolution to what happened with Lamar Jackson and his contract situation last year. So you did see like the Ravens and the Browns, I would say, kind of flip for who's going to be like the second or third best team in the AFC North. But outside of that, you don't see a ton of, I would say, line movement. I do think, kind of like you mentioned, Greg, like there are definitely opportunities for teams that you maybe in some ways could have taken one approach to the NFL draft and very much went a different path. And I think that one of those teams that I very much want to highlight is the Seattle Seahawks. I think, with them kind of being at the fifth overall selection, very much there was a discussion of if they were going to take their quarterback of the future, maybe, the guy that was going to sit behind Geno Smith for a year or two and then develop and maybe kind of turn into this long-term starter on a roster that was very much, I would say, kind of heading in the right direction after last year's draft class. But I think they obviously went a different path, and they very much, I would say, kind of pressed some situations that they could find value in, and are very much, I would say, in win now mode. And I think that you can maybe say that they are a team that you could target in the futures market just kind of based on what they did for the draft, getting, the best cornerback in football in Devin Witherspoon, getting the best, wide receiver in Jackson Smith-Njigba as well. So I think they filled quality needs, kind of signaled the approach that they're going to take to a team building philosophy in the next couple seasons with Geno Smith at the helm. And I think they very much seem to want to win now with Pete Carroll, as the head coach. So I think they're kind of the one team that I think you could definitely say their stock would be bumped up based on how they approached and then, I would say executed these last 3 days of the NFL draft.
And I think that the NFC West is fascinating because I do think that it's one of the most lopsided divisions in all of football. The 49ers, despite the fact that they've got a little bit of turmoil at the quarterback spot because darn near everyone got hurt last season for the 49ers. But, I mean, past that, this is just a locked and loaded roster. They really didn't need a lot in the NFL draft because they've got a good defense, they've got a great running game, they've got a good offensive line. So you've got all those boxes checked. But I do think that the Seahawks sort of fortify themselves as sort of that number 2 team right now, which is insane to say because 12 months ago, we were talking about the LA Rams being the defending champions and everything like that, and they're a team that as well, because they just lacked any sort of capital in the NFL draft, they weren't able to do anything, and I think that, to your point, the Seahawks, they then vault up because they were able to utilize their draft picks and be able to get, in my opinion, the best wide receiver in Smith-Njigba.
Yeah, and definitely. And I do think, you can go back to how San Francisco kind of played the draft as well, right? I mean, they used a top 100 pick on Jake Moody. Obviously, they thought they had a need at the kicker position, but very much I would say drafting a guy like that, in the third round is very much a luxury pick. And I do think the guys that they drafted around him as well with their, other two, third round picks, Cameron Latu, who was it still very much projects to be a project at the tight end position, very much going to be the backup to George Kittle for quite some time. Really isn't going to see, I would say, meaningful football snaps on the field this season outside of some special teams plays. And then Jair Brown, who, can kind of do it all from a Penn State perspective for the Nittany Lions last year. But I don't know if he really, I would say, really kind of fits in with what they're trying to do from a schematic standpoint. And I also think he doesn't really address where they were kind of weak at last season at the cornerback position. So I think you can kind of take both sides of it in the NFC West. You can say that the Seahawks, very much set up to win now and kind of are building for this 2023 season. And, the 49ers and the Rams, kind of like you said, they just don't have the draft capital to compete and are very much, they did get a little bit better, but they probably didn't get better at the right spots. And they could be both teams that, might have a much smaller gap to where the Seattle Seahawks are eventually going to finish in the NFC West, when it's all said and done.
Yep, and I think that the Seahawks, to your point, I thought that they did a tremendous job in the draft, but my highest draft grade has to go to the Philadelphia Eagles, who are just becoming Georgia North at this point, because, even in the fourth round, taking the quarterback in Ringo, they got, in my opinion, just absolutely insane value there. That was a guy that many people thought was going to be off the board more around the second round, but, the way that they were able to play it, there were a lot of people that were thinking, oh, with their first pick, they're going to be taking Nolan Smith, and they got Nolan Smith, but at pick number 30, they got arguably one of the best players in the NFL draft in Jalen Carter as well. What did you think of the Eagles? Because it's not really going to move the needle in terms of the futures market, because they were already one of those top teams. But out of all those teams that were maybe towards the top, I felt like they did by far the best job of drafting and fortifying what was already a good defense.
Yeah, very much so. I think that, they're very much like the kind of the very obvious takeaway was that they don't reach for any players. They very much kind of let the board fall to them. And in a lot of ways, it really worked out with what they needed on their roster, I would say, to kind of continue to be, the best team in the NFC and very much the class of the NFC. And I think you're demonstrating that. I think, Howie Roseman very much is setting up to be, the best GM in football. And I think this draft class specifically is just going to be kind of another notch on his belt, right? Like you said, Jalen Carter at 9, who, PFF had as the second best, player on our big board, to get them 7 spots later, especially in, in the top 10. Like, that's a move that you just don't see that often. And then kind of like you said, Nolan Smith, top 15 type player, getting him at 30. I also think, going further on down, like I talked about this guy last week, but Tanner McKee, I think, is, PFF's most accurate passer from PFF's perspective. I know the broadcast really liked him in the 6th round. I thought he could be very much like a 2nd or 3rd round draft pick as well. So they just identified people, and I think they find reasons for why they can get these guys in the board in the building. And I think, even the direction and, the jokes that we're kind of getting of, them building, Philadelphia, Georgia, or the Philadelphia Bulldogs, or all these other things, but that's a winning culture, right? And that's something that they're trying to continuously build upon. And they even talked about, like, when you have guys that you played with in college, like, the transition to the NFL is going to be so much easier because you have friends off the field, where you want to live, who you want to hang out with, and it kind of just continues to breed the culture that is so much further ahead than everybody else. So I love the play as well. I do love Keely Ringo. I thought he was going to be close to a 2nd round pick, but I think he kind of fits in perfectly and could be, from even, very close to a day 1 starter as well in the 4th round. So I think they had a lot of hits, and it's really hard to knock anything that they've done from a draft or trading perspective, I would say, the past 3 seasons.
No doubt about it. As we're recapping the NFL draft right here on the Greg Peterson Experience with a man that does a great job of taking a look at all things football, and Ben Brown over at Pro Football Focus. And on the flip side, we're going to hit upon what Will Levis to the Tennessee Titans means, because that was one of the biggest steals of the draft. But how about if in our final 90 seconds here in this segment, we take a look at a team that maybe felt like made a reach or two, or just fell short in general in the NFL draft? Because I wouldn't say that there was any team that they just completely flunked the draft, but there were a few questionable decisions, especially up top.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, the culprit number 1 has to be the Detroit Lions. I would say Jahmyr Gibbs, obviously, probably would have landed in the 1st round either way, but to select him at 12th overall, does feel like a little bit of a reach. And then, I would say not really capitalizing on premium positions with either one of their 1st round draft selections. I know Jack Campbell's a guy that can come in and play 850 to 900 snaps for them and be really productive, but at a low value position, taking him 18th overall, it just seems like they still have gaps on their roster, and they're making some of these luxury picks. And I still think that that's going to leave them, I would say, in a lot of ways, vulnerable to 1 or 2 injuries that could very much, I would say, derail this, restoration of restoring the roar and all these other things for the Detroit Lions. So I think they had a pretty, I would say, poor draft class. I think the other teams you can knock are very much the teams that gave up a lot or seemed to mortgage their future to kind of go up and get one guy, a la Houston Texans, who still very much feel like they're a few players away. And I don't really think Will Anderson Jr. probably moves the needle enough for them to potentially mortgage, an opportunity to add a guy like Caleb Williams or Drake May in next year's draft class. So I think selling out low on some of these guys and giving up some future picks is just not something I can get on board with.
Yep, they need to get as many players in as humanly possible. And You always need to get as much analysis as humanly possible from Ben Brown because he knows his football, does great work over at Pro Football Focus. And coming next, got to talk about Will Levis to the Titans and what that means for them right here on the Greg Peterson Experience on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. One of the most notable things that we saw from the NFL draft, in my opinion, really lingered on 2 days. The fact that Will Levis followed the first round, and when we were doing our previews of the NFL draft, I don't think any of us saw that happening, but he lands in the lap of the Tennessee Titans early on Friday. What do you make out of the Titans situation now? Because we knew that they were going to be taking a look at a quarterback, and getting a guy like Levis when they did, I thought was tremendous value, and I think that this now puts them in a circumstance where they could start him at any time, but I really don't see him being the day one starter unless we see something pretty demonstrative when it comes to preseason.
Yeah, I would be shocked if he beats out Ryan Tannehill. It does seem like, at least the initial, news and everything else is that he's going to be the number 3 guy behind Malik Willis as well. I don't think that's going to last very long. And he very much has the talent, I would say, to beat out Ryan Tannehill. It's been a situation that, thrives heavily on play action. So he's going to have a lot easier, I would say, throws available to him than what he had at Kentucky. So I actually like the fit quite a bit. I think a lot of people expected him to be drafted at the 11th overall pick for the Tennessee Titans. So the fact that they got him, 22 picks later at 33 overall, it just speaks to an ability to kind of identify where the rest of the league was at on this quarterback class and really, I would say, go up and get a guy that, very much probably should have been within the first 15 picks. So I liked it quite a bit. I think that both, the AFC South teams, well, I guess all 3 AFC South teams kind of came away with their quarterback, but I think, the Will Levis situation hinged so much on what the Indianapolis Colts did at number 4 overall. And I kind of think they're not necessarily smoke screen, but their ability to keep it close to the vest with what one they actually prefer between Anthony Richardson and Will Levis was, I would say, a really good testament to maybe the direction that the Indianapolis Colts are headed as well. So I think overall, if you're a fan of the Titans or the Colts, you have to feel, I would say, pretty confident about the direction of both these teams. Maybe not bottoming out as bad as we thought they needed to or have to, I would say, to kind of get back to relevancy in the AFC South.
And speaking of quarterbacks that we were having some question marks as to where they were going to be drafted, Stetson Bennett is now the backup in Los Angeles because they couldn't maintain Baker Mayfield in the offseason, who's now with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and that's a really interesting quarterback situation as well. But got a guy in Matthew Stafford that's coming off of back issues, and when it comes to back issues, the one thing that you don't know is that you never know what to expect with those. And now the only backup on the roster to Matthew Stafford is Stetson Bennett. I don't know about you, but the Rams didn't have a lot of picks. I would have probably traded up for a different quarterback. I want to get your thoughts on this, though, because I thought it was intriguing. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, intriguing is a very good way of putting it. And I think you look around and the way in which the Rams kind of won that Super Bowl 2 years ago, they had a few really key guys at key positions that were by far the best player at those positions, right? They had the Jalen Ramsey. They had Matthew Stafford, who was very much, I would say, a top 3 quarterback at that point. Cooper Kupp as well, Aaron Donald. And they didn't really have, I would say, a ton else around them. And I think you kind of look around their roster, and in a lot of ways, they are still really bare like that. They don't have a ton of, wide receiver depth outside of Cooper Kupp. Didn't really address that whatsoever until like the 5th round. So the fact that they went with a backup quarterback, I think signals, a longer term rebuild that needs to happen and is probably going to happen in Los Angeles than what people are probably giving them credit for. I know that they are, the third most likely team to win the NFC West, but that's mainly because the Arizona Cardinals are very much expected to be the worst team in football. But I think you can look around and going back to it with the NFC West, like they could easily have 2 of the bottom 5 teams in football playing in that division. I think like the general direction for the Rams just isn't appealing. I don't like the pick whatsoever, and I think that long term, this is a situation that could get a lot worse before it gets better.
And I know that at DraftKings, there was a prop as to where Stetson Bennett was going to be going. If you were taking a look at the higher side, and if you were taking a look at the under in terms of draft position, you did quite well there. And this is another team I thought had a very interesting quarterback situation going into the draft. And they did less than the LA Rams because they didn't pick a quarterback at all. That'd be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They signed Baker Mayfield in the offseason. They've got Kyle Trask, who they did invest a second-round pick in, but that was 2 years ago in 2021. And that was the number 64 pick, so that's as late in the second round as it gets. were you a little bit surprised that they didn't draft Will Levis at 19 and completely passed on the entire board of quarterbacks? Because I thought at some point they were going to draft someone, and if you thought that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were going to take a quarterback, it came up snake eyes.
Yeah, I think it is a really perplexing situation. I think the one thing that a lot of people are going to point to is maybe Tom Brady is not necessarily as retired as we all thought he was going to be, right? Because I very much thought that they would get somebody in the fold, I would say. But they, like you said, they have Baker Mayfield, Kyle Trask, but this is still a situation that it is very ugly. They didn't really, I would say, go out and get any top playmakers at skill positions as well. I think they drafted a lot of what seemed in some ways like pro-ready type players, Yaya Diaby, Cody Manch as well, the tackle out of North Dakota State. Like these are guys that can kind of step in and play right away. So it's a little bit perplexing given the state of this roster because they very much are kind of veteran laden and have a talent in a lot of key positions, but very much don't have any real solution at the quarterback position. So it is, I would say, concerning. I still think they're probably not in contention to, win the NFC South right now, especially if we don't see Kyle Trask or Baker Mayfield, I would say, play at a top 10 level. But it's a situation that I very much would have tried to get one or two more options at the quarterback position if this was the direction that you're going to go for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Yep, I'm right there with you. That was a little bit confusing to me. Now, I do think that Cody Mock, who comes out of North Dakota State, now, if you'd see the photos of him with the long flowing hair and having no teeth whatsoever, you know that guy is a football player. But right. At the same time, I would have probably taken a quarterback if I were the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And while we highlight some of the bad, what were some of the biggest impact picks that were made outside the first round that you take a look at and you agree with? Like, I'll throw this one out here on the Greg Peterson Experience on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. Michael Mayer going to the Raiders. Almost want to call them the Oakland Raiders. That was a while ago, but I thought that being able to pick them up in the second round with the fact that they did lose Darren Waller in the offseason, I thought that was an A-plus move for them. That is one that I very much did like, so I give them some kudos there. Is there any that really stood out to you?
Yeah, I did like the Michael Mayer pick. There was that weird, I would say, run on tight ends, and you very much would have expected him to be, if it wasn't the first wide tight end off the board, which he was very much priced to be before the draft, like him to go so much further down than what he actually did was a surprise. So I definitely like that pick. Another one that I think was really good, Jonathan Mingo, kind of, I can say, was going to fill in for that DJ Moore type role in Carolina, does give Bryce Young a young receiving option to grow with. Didn't necessarily, I would say, produce a ton at the college level, but was one of the biggest risers, I would say, in kind of the pre-draft process. Is very much kind of this workout warrior type player that has a really good size and athleticism, tested really well. So I did really like the Jonathan Mingo pick in the second round for the Panthers. I know people are going to question, how much they gave up to get to number one overall, but I thought what they did outside of that, was kind of a testament to the direction that they could get relatively quickly. And then, another one, another receiver that I really like, Marvin Mims, I think is definitely kind of an analytical darling, high, yards per route run, high yards per reception type player, can definitely win downfield, was really good for Oklahoma, basically. I think the Denver Broncos, continuing to try and figure out what they can do with Russell Wilson at quarterback and finding a guy that can very much, I would say, maximize the strengths of Russell Wilson was a spot that I really like. So I really like that pick in the second round as well. A couple skill position players that I think kind of rounded out really well what turned out to be a pretty deep, I would say, wide receiver class.
We've got about 90 seconds. I'm going to throw this out there about the team that I root for, the Green Bay Packers. What did you think of their overall draft? Because you knew that they were going to build around Jordan Love, and you were unsure if the Packers were going to take a quarterback or not. The lone guy that they took is Sean Clifford, who, if he ever starts for the Green Bay Packers, I think it's donezo for them.
Right, yeah. It's going to be ugly. I think you got to be all in with Jordan Love, and I think, his top-end range can win this team, I would say, an NFC North crown, especially if you think the Detroit Lions, I would say, didn't really press their edge as well as they should have in this particular draft. I think the Green Bay Packers got a lot better at crucial positions. Lucas Van Ness, a guy that maybe some people will say is a little bit overdrafted, but I think Luke Musgrave kind of has it all from the tight end position. And the one real reason he was probably even available at the 42nd overall pick was because of the injury situation, only playing 2 games last year. But he is a legitimate, I would say, playmaker at the tight end position. And then Jaden Reed as well out of Michigan State. Like, there's guys where they are kind of heading in the right direction, I would say, from Green Bay's perspective. So if you give Jordan Love, the opportunity to maybe grow into this a little bit in 1 or 2 years, like this could be a really good, solid, young offensive team that really didn't experience any sort of drop off too dramatically, I would say, from going, to Aaron Rodgers to Jordan Love. And I think that has to be the hope. So I know they're going all in with Jordan Love. If that bottoms out this year, they'll at least have the opportunity to maybe take a guy highly next year in the draft. So I think that's the reason why you saw them move past the quarterback position in this particular draft.
Go to VSiN.com/subscribe to become a VSiN Pro subscriber today.